Thanks for coming and talking to us.
Sure.
You moved to Los Angeles as an adult from I guess from Utah by way of Idaho, or the other way around. How did the city affect your writing, your decision to be a writer, the kinds of material you were looking at? Was there an early influence of Southern California on your work?
You know, I really grew up in a house without books in Utah, so I came to reading very late when I was about 19 years old. And when I discovered literature, I said, "Oh my God, who knew?" You know, Virginia Woolf and Henry James and D.H. Lawrence, and this is what I wanted to do. And I really began to be a reader, and sort of taught myself to write. And I was living in Idaho at the time. I was teaching skiing, writing stories at night. And in about 1977, I said, you know, I really need to move to a city and be around people who are doing what I want to do. And as a Westerner, I felt like Los Angeles was that city. And when I moved here, one of the first writers that I started to read through a friend of mine was Raymond Chandler. And I thought, wow, that's Los Angeles. I mean, and I still think that he really got the city. He got underneath the city. He got everything about the city.
Well, let's talk about him a little bit, because you've written a book about him, The Long Embrace, and about his relationship with his wife, but also about him and all of the places he lived, his relationship with the city. What is it about Chandler that speaks so centrally to Los Angeles?
I think Los Angeles, when Chandler lived here in the 20s and 30s, at the time he was making himself into a writer, was so exquisitely corrupt. And I think he understood that he could take this lowly form of the mystery novel, and he could create a character like Philip Marlowe, a quintessential kind of an American guy, who really represented an individual conscience, the conscience of the individual, and that when all of the other institutions of society sort of fail, here was this guy, Philip Marlowe, when the police were corrupt and the mayor was corrupt and when the press was corrupt and no one could go to anyone. Here was Marlowe, who sort of represents that American individualism via Chandler's experience in, you know, Victorian England, being educated the way he was. So I think in a wonderful way he got the language of the common man. He got Los Angeles because he arrived in 1912 when it was really becoming this first modern city that was sort of being packaged and sold. He figured out that the corruption was the essence of Los Angeles, and that it was real estate, and that it was the movies. And, you know, he got underneath it, he got inside it. He was a lyrical writer, he was a funny writer, but he also really wrote in the language of the common man. And he elevated this kind of lowly form, and he saw Los Angeles as, and I think he was prescient. I think he saw the way violence would become such an endemic part of the society.
I've always thought that, you know, Los Angeles was the only place a writer like Chandler, partly because of the corruption, as you're saying, and he certainly got his first-hand experience of that from working in the oil industry in the 1920s, but also because of the presence of Hollywood and the kind of influence of, they wouldn't have called it pop culture then, but we can call it that now, that only a writer coming out or operating in that territory would have been able to use a vernacular form like the mystery novel as a way of writing literature. That the divisions would have been too pronounced in a city like New York. He wouldn't have been able to. I think of Edmund Wilson's, you know, critique of crime fiction as, you know, a minor vice like crossword puzzles and cigarette smoking. That idea would have been too prevalent in New York. Chandler would have never a Chandler would have never been able to emerge there. What do you think that's true?
I think that's true, and I think it's the complexity of the myth of Los Angeles and the way it was sold and packaged, and it's the combination of the darkness also under this exquisite atmosphere, the sunshine, the glamour of Hollywood, the waking up every day in this, you know, beautiful world, and then underneath that, the rottenness. And I don't think you would get that in Chicago. You know, I don't think you would get that in New York. And I think that, you know, in 1922, the murder rate in Los Angeles was three times what it was in Chicago and in New York. And I don't think people think of LA that way. that with all of the wealth and the hype and the real estate and the oil and the money and Hollywood and the glamour, also came drugs and exquisite corruption and a tremendous amount of violence. Yeah.
The Long Embrace is your first book of nonfiction. You also have written 4 novels and a collection of short stories. Was that a difficult transition to move from writing fiction into a book of nonfiction? What were the challenges that were particular to nonfiction that you hadn't encountered in writing fiction?
It's funny because people, think that it's, you have to make a big shift, but I didn't. And I think one reason was I decided to bring a novelist sensibility to the idea of writing biography. And I didn't try and disguise myself. I'm not a traditional biographer. And I wanted this book to be as much a portrait of a city as it was of a writer and of his rather unique marriage to a woman who was almost 20 years older. So from the very beginning, from the first paragraph, it's the I voice, and it's me. And it's me searching for Los Angeles.
Well, you operate in the book almost as a kind of detective in your own way.
In a way, as a detective myself. I mean, Chandler moved almost 40 different times in and around this city. He was constantly moving. And part of the structure of the book was that I was going to track down every place where he ever lived and photograph what I found and sort of try and look at what was he writing when he lived in this place. And of course, I came to believe that one of the reasons he got LA so well is because he literally knew it from every angle. And he knew the rich people from working in the oil industry, and he knew the poor people from being in the oil fields with the guys who were working on the rigs and the secretaries and hanging out in bars. So I think that when S.J. Perelman called him LA's finest social historian, I think he was right. I think he was more than just a fiction writer. I think he was capturing LA from so many different angles.
Now, when people think of Chandler, they tend to think of, I think generally, the first 2 books, either The Big Sleep or Farewell, My Lovely. What do you have a favorite of all of the Chandler books? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, I think my favorite is The Long Goodbye. And it was his 6th novel, his last good novel. He wrote one after that wasn't very good at all. And he wrote it while his wife was dying. He wrote it after he left LA. I think it's the book in which Marlowe becomes most fully human.
Well, it's a big shift. Marlowe, I mean, there are little bits and pieces in the early books where you get a little bit of insight, but Marlowe really does. He's getting older. He's vulnerable in a way he hasn't been in the earlier books.
He's very vulnerable, and as Chandler himself said, I wrote my best book as my wife lay dying. And it's interesting that in that book, Philip Marlowe, who basically is unavailable to women, in all of the previous novels, a good hard kiss is about as much as Marlowe ever gets or gives. But in The Long Goodbye, at the end of it, he actually has his first sleepover with a woman. And, as Chandler is losing his wife, he's really giving Marlowe the first inklings of allowing Marlowe to have an intimacy that he's never had before. And, I find it an interesting combination of the way that Chandler split himself in 3 ways. Into Roger Wade, the writer, into Philip Marlowe, the detective, and into Terry Lennox, who was Marlowe's best friend, and one might say his love interest in the end, his true love interest.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.